Good evening.
Hello.
Liz, before I ask you a few questions about Sporting Guide, I wondered if you would read a brief passage, just so people can get a sense of it.
Sure. I'll read you a short bit. This is called Youth. I remember it was unseasonably cold that day, the first time I saw you. I wore my new overcoat from City of Paris, double-breasted with bighorn buttons. I bought the evening edition of the Herald from the boy in the lobby and had it tucked under my arm. I planned to sit in the park and read before supper. But as I walked the paths toward the row of benches, there you were, leaning casually against a cypress tree, and I found I couldn't sit at all. The collar of your shirt turned up for protection against the crisp air, your hands shoved in your pockets when they weren't lighting another cigarette, waiting. I must have walked around in circles for an hour, summoning my courage to approach. I shut out the calls of the others, hungry for the notes burning holes in my pocket. Even the beautiful red-headed one, a little older than you, told me he was the descendant of a musketeer. I looked down at my paper, scanning the ink, until he walked away. Then I closed my eyes, thinking of the bulge in your pants straining against fabric, my lips around your member, thrusting yourself deeper into my mouth, hallucinatory undulations taking me over. Under my coat, my trousers rose. I folded the paper across my lap, peering around to see if you were watching. Feeling disappointed, you'd left your post. I came every night that week, the same routine, late for supper several times, all the while thinking of you, wishing your hands would brush against mine, walking the paths distracted by the colors of the leaves, wondering if they were more real than we would ever be, silly daydreams that hadn't occurred since I was a boy. And every time I crossed your path, slowing my pace to a crawl, hoping you'd look at me, clearing my throat to utter a greeting, I would waver once more. It was the following Tuesday that you finally glanced up as I rounded the bend, cracking your mouth into a wide smile. It took a while to appreciate your grin was meant for me, hidden as it was behind veils of smoke rising up, licking the tobacco stuck to your bottom lip, breath hot and sweet. I could barely breathe myself as I moved toward you, anticipating rejection, bracing myself for the heartbreak of your lips. Without a word, you turned and walked toward a line of hedges behind the gazebo. I followed, obedient, stopping only when you did, tucked safely inside the shade of the shrubbery. You held out your hand and I fumbled in my trousers, my fingers shaking, pulling out a wad of notes and pressing them into your palm. Silently you took me, and a jolt went through my bones like I'd never recover. Your tongue on my neck, turning me over and pushing me into the branches, a mouthful of foliage tasting like your sweat as you pounded me into submission, your fluids dripping down my legs, wanting it all over again as soon as you had your way. I go home, smelling of us, masking our tryst in heavy cologne. She's already asleep, the children tucked away safely. I creep in, murmuring your name as I crawl into the sheets beside her, turning my back so I can smile in the dark, counting the hours, counting my change, until I can see you again.
Now, if you haven't looked at the book, you really need to, because it's a bit difficult to describe. It's a very idiosyncratic mix of first-person narratives by a number of speakers, historical fact, illustration, all of it housed within a sporting guide. And can you explain what that is, first of all?
Sure. Sporting guides existed in every time period, culture, language, and they were privately printed and distributed little black books, or in this case red, guidebooks to a city's best brothels. They're the best whores, the best services provided at each of the brothels, whether they had a turn-down service or pressed your trousers when you left, what kind of wines they might have, particular girls of note.
And who published these?
They were sort of independently published. People would take it upon themselves. There was a running one in England called Harris's Lists that started in the 15th century that was, published
So you'd sort of ask under the counter and get it wrapped in brown paper or something. Yeah. Now, so how did you decide to write this? How did it come about? It must have been a gradual process.
Well, I was always really interested in prostitution from a very early age. I think I saw Mayflower Madam starring Candice Bergen when I was a kid. And I fantasized in high school. I went to boarding school on the East Coast about buying the library across the street from school where we all would smoke behind and turning it into a brothel, and I would be the madam, and all of my peers would either be my patrons or my girls, but I would, you know, operate it like a private club and give 100% of the girls' cut to them, and they could have an entry fee, basically.
It's not too late. You can totally make this a reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's illegal, so that's one issue, but...
It's illegal right now, but, you know, it's
yeah, it's possible.
The book may change the conversation. You were saying earlier when we were talking that you really can't write a character unless you're feeling it and living it. And I wonder particularly about the character of Cora Phillips, who is a madam in the book who runs the most luxurious, I think you described it as a kind of a dream brothel, where the girls get like 2 baths a day and are under constant physician's care and live in beautifully appointed suites, and it's all very discreet and elegant. And I wonder how you developed her character and came to inhabit it.
And she's addicted to laudanum.
Yeah, well, there's that.
Yeah. Gosh, well, Cora Phillips was actually a real person who I knew very little about, although we found her gravesite last year, which was pretty exciting. I did a grave rubbing that's in the book, but I made her British. I felt, and you know, it was interesting as I was writing it, I would identified with different characters more at certain times. For a long time, the person I felt closest to was Mr. X. And then I felt closest to Francis, who's a 13-year-old orphan. And then it was Jack, who's a 17-year-old gay hustler. And for him, I actually would channel a lot of Kanye and Jay-Z as I was developing his voice. But I think Cora is who I ended up identifying with the most.
She does feel kind of like the heart of the book.
Yeah, and in a way, she's the one who really wants to escape.
So how did you go about researching this project? It feels like an almost overwhelming task.
It was overwhelming, and I think because it's my second book that encompasses a lot of research at a certain point, it's more about knowing when you have to stop, and knowing when you have to. I love history so much, and I love facts, and there's so many things I couldn't keep in that didn't make sense for the story, and when you have to let fall in love with your characters and let them tell you what you're going to do. So because there's images and ephemera in the book, I went back, I did a second round of research just for that part. Just like that was a really fun treasure hunt.
How long did the whole project take you?
About 8 years.
I didn't actually realize it was quite that long,
yeah.
But of course it makes sense, and when you read the book you'll see that. So at any point did it interfere with the living of modern life to be so immersed?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's always hard to sit in a dark room by yourself writing, or a light room by yourself writing, and not know if what you're doing is any good. But actually a lot of contemporary experience and life is in this book. A lot of the conversations and dialogue were taken from real life.
That was one thing I wondered about, how you developed the period voices and vernacular, and did you have to read almost exclusively from period documents and then immediately go into writing, or was there music or scents you used to transport yourself, or was it easier than that?
I feel like I live so much in the past as it is that I can just close my eyes and be there. What was really fun was the slang. It was like trying to diversify different slang terms for pussy.
Something has was gonna.
Honey, I'm like trying to stay away from ones that I already use. So the swear words were really fun. Yeah.
In terms of like this idea of time travel, it's Los Angeles is almost a character. I'd say it is a character in the book. Early Los Angeles, a period that you don't often see. People talk about the golden age of Hollywood and the early days, but they tend to gloss over a little bit the real Wild West, when it was a very small and unsophisticated town. And you really bring that to life. How much of that is still visible in modern LA?
Well, downtown LA still has a lot of, the landmarks. I researched a lot at the Los Angeles Central Library, and the California Club is next door. There's a timeline in the back of the book that references a lot of landmarks that are still there, and Cole's PE Buffet and Philippe the original French dip sandwich place. Yeah, but people definitely associate Los Angeles with noir, or film noir, as opposed to the time period I'm writing about, which is well before the movie business.
It's not glamorous as we think of it, but in a way, I mean, it's even more alluring because it's so exotic.
Yeah, but although, I like to point out the fact that we had the Fifth Symphony in the Nation in 1898, so it wasn't a cultural wasteland that everyone thinks of, and it really wasn't like the Wild West, as you said, because a lot of the streets were paved, there were electric street lights.
It was a city.
Yeah, it was a city. Downtown was pretty well developed. Women dressed in the latest fashions. Ostrich feathers were very popular for big hats and silk stockings. And
what did you find the Western attitude towards sexuality was versus the rest of the country?
I wouldn't actually say it was that different. Victorian sexuality was very much divided between men. A man and a woman were not supposed to lie together unless they were procreating, even in marriage, and women were taught that orgasms were wrong, and that they would interfere with conception. But men had these natural sexual desires and sexual urges, and they needed a place to expend themselves, and so prostitution was encouraged for men.
And you also deal very frankly with like child prostitution, and there's one character in the book there's two madams in the book, one of whom is a real pragmatist, and the other who runs this dream brothel. And they're kind of set in opposition, and the one has no qualms about procuring whatever her customers want and catering to all their desires.
Virgin auctions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That is a real thing. It still is a real thing.
Did you base her on anyone in particular?
She came from a lot of different, an amalgamation of a lot of different people and types. But she was actually also, Pearl Morton was a real person as well. There are three characters who were real people.
How did you discover them?
Bartolo Ballerino, who was a real man, who was an immigrant, slumlord of LA. He owned all of the low rent prostitution joints, which were dollar housing, dollar a trick, dollar crib joints. I found through land records. I wanted to know who owned that whole area. Pearl Morton and Cora Phillips, I'd read about them actually in a sporting guide that I came across, which, I'm going to get really geeky here, but it might actually be this historical hoax that this historian in the 1950s made this fake 1897 sporting guide and then planted it in historical archives to make it look like it was old. There's a lot of
just to
this is like a real academic joke.
Just to screw with all these historians. Yeah.
It's a scandal. It's quite a scandal in the librarian community.
It's the most labor-intensive joke.
It's kind of
cool, the joke is kind of.
I actually went deep and I read all of this particular historian's own notes and archives to try to figure it out. And we were going to include an image of the book in the book, but then again, some members of the academic community were not sure if it was really real. So.
Well, But whether or not it's a valid document, how were the brothels of Cora and Pearl described in that book?
Just the names, just very
Just
vaguely. I completely, made them up completely. Yeah.
One thing that was so interesting about both the photos and the text is that there was like a real red light district in LA.
Yeah.
And when did that kind of go underground a little bit?
Well, it was legal at the time period I'm writing about, but actually Pearl Morton, who opens up the book, she moved her operations into what was the county courthouse. In real life, she really did. So it was not only tolerated, but these women and Bartolo Ballerino, they were helping to really build the city. They were the businessmen, and people say that prostitutes settled the West, and it's true.
So there's a lot of people who are descended from sex workers, presumably, in LA.
Well, I would say probably anywhere, right?
It's true.
There's a lot of people that are descended from sex workers, but there's also a lot of women who died in unmarked graves and who didn't have children or didn't have families, and died old and penniless once their bodies and their youth gave out. It's a very there's parts of the book and the world aesthetically that might seem glamorous, but I tried to really give a sense of it is not a glamorous profession.
It's clearly something that is a real interest to you, because in your prior book as well, you dealt with a group of women who were using sexuality, in that case, the last generation of burlesque dancers, not all of whom were well-known or work in glamorous places by any means, but who were people of tremendous strength and dignity and not remotely ashamed of what they'd done to make a living. And clearly this is something that resonates with you.
Well, I think that it's an occupation that many people don't have a choice but to do, and I think that I really try in general to take a non-judgmental view of humanity, and just because someone has to do this or that is their profession, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve our respect and dignity. That why should they be scorned after they're also their bodies are being used? It just seems like a very unfair attitude to take, and in general I want to shine a light on people who've been forgotten by history.
And when you open up your own brothel, I mean, the conditions will be so opulent that it will...
Well, I was telling you that I did actually build a brothel in LA as an art installation a couple of years ago. That was only open for one night, and it was a theatrical performance. So my girls it was fully nude, but you couldn't touch them, you couldn't talk to them. So it was very, very voyeuristic, and that fulfilled some of my desire to see and feel and like what the brothel would
Yet you were saying when you put that together, the lengths you went to evoke it, the perfume you had designed, which mingled sweat and powder, and when you think about time travel, do you find going to literal places, smelling literal things helps you a lot, or?
Sometimes I can sit in this room and close my eyes and trip out and imagine what it would be like, 40 years ago. But I also like to time travel into the future. I mean, I fantasize a lot about time travel. I like to think about like what real estate I would buy, what art I would buy, and what clothes I would buy, and then I think like, how would I get it back with me?
I always think like, would you have money? Like, how would you have the period money?
Well, because I would take my money now, and then I would go back, and I would invest it really wisely.
Okay, but here's the problem with this thought experiment, because I do it all the time. Like, when you go to the bank and they see the more modern, like, you try to find old money first?
Well, actually,
will they accept it, or will
my
they
first thought is that when I go back, they're going to think I'm a witch, right? Because you're not, like, you would go back but dressed in contemporary clothing.
Yeah, you have to buy new clothes
and a contemporary lexicon, and you'd have a cell phone. right? So they like, witch, we're gonna burn you.
Well, when are you traveling to?
At any time, right? Even if you travel back like 100 years or 50 years, they'd be suspicious.
Can I tell you, this is really pathetic, but I often fantasize about, I'm like, what would you do with your time? I would buy so many new vintage clothes.
I would too!
Yeah.
I would too!
And it's like, how much can you bring back with you? Like, there's a lot.
Then you have to make it invisible and weightless.
Don't I know it? I know.
Sorry, we're totally digressing here,
but no, this is important. In reading the book, I wondered, one thing I wondered about is ghosts, because it's something I always think about. Like, it just seems like, as you say, if you believe in any form of the supernatural, even in kind of a symbolic way, like, people, many of whom died and were maltreated, would have restless spirits, and I don't know. I wonder if there are sites that were brothels that are haunted in LA.
Definitely. Well, I've actually been to, bless you, I went to a brothel in New York that was, I felt, I don't know, I knew that it was, I found out that it was a brothel, but I felt some very bad energy there. I really believe in ghosts. I've had a lot of important transitional moments in my life where, because I felt some sort of voice speaking to me, calling me, telling me to do something, and actually in Los Angeles, I'm in the second place I've lived in that this one movie star, Norma Talmadge, lived in. So I'm basically following her ghost around LA without trying to. And it was an amazing experience going to visit Cora Phillips' grave, and actually someone that was working with me on research for the book, he recently went and visited her and put flowers on her grave and sent us a picture of it, which was really, that was very touching. So I sort of hope that she's out there somewhere thinking that, wow, people 100+ years later are going to think about her and remember her and want to know more about her.
Well, on that note, I know you want to open it up to questions pretty quickly, so thank you very much, and we will take any questions you have. I can call on people on my list of things.
Hi. Something I really love about the book is that you know, we see all these characters' lives in a slice. We only see a portion of their lives, and I wonder, you know, and you leave it up to our imagination to see what happened to them. I wonder if do you know what their ends are? Did you imagine the rest of their lives?
I know exactly what happens to everything. I know who they fall in love with. I know, but I don't want to reveal that because then you won't watch the TV show. So yes, the answer is yes.
Any other questions?
It's not entirely fair, but Liz, why did you choose to write it as fiction rather than nonfiction?
Because I had the characters in my head first, the fictional characters. I had X in my head, and Francis and Jack, and a version of Cora Phillips. So yeah, I knew that it was a fictional story. But for me, fact and fiction are always intertwined. Even if you ask me what I did yesterday, chances are I will embellish highly on the version of events just because it makes a better story. So it's always a hybrid.
On that note, and this would be for you and your others here, I was curious about how you decided to structure it the way you did. It just seemed like, I mean, the order in which you did it, I wondered if you wrote each character's pieces all at once and then put them together, or whether you did it more sequentially as they came to you, as the spirits kind of moved you, and how you decided to put in the historical portions in which you talk about larger questions of sexuality or birth control. Or
well, I completely rewrote the book, actually. It was originally written third person. So I totally rewrote the book with the 6 main characters, each in their first person, and then I had an amazing editor who's sitting right here. And it was a very I would say we didn't really talk that much about the order of it, maybe, but my editor and my publisher were both very supportive in the fact that it was going to be a strange book, that it was not going to, it was hard for me to figure out the structure because I didn't really see anything else that looked like what I wanted to do. I was really interested, I was reading Dos Passos and Luke Sante, Low Life, and Jack Black, You Can't Win, and then that Hemingway short story, War Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn, was a big influence. So I wanted it to feel like this time travel document where you have these character stories and then the interstitial historical chapters are written in a tense where someone from the future who's gone back to that time is giving you the lay of the land in the present tense of that time, but as though they came from, they were like Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, and they have a knowledge of all the fonts and the historical events that have come since. So that you can, and then there's these poetic interludes that if you read the book in order or the chapter that came just before, you'll know that it's set in that character's world, but you can also read the book completely out of order.
Did you always know you wanted it to look physically like a sporting guide?
Well, it doesn't actually really look like a sporting guide, but I'm very specific about how I wanted to look down to the size and placement of the barcode on the back of the book. So,
it's really beautiful.
Thank you. I was really lucky again to have a really good team of people to work with that believed in my vision even when I was being difficult.
Never.
I think we had a question over here. Is it Glenna?
Oh yeah, I was going to ask about the historical interstitials as well. So you've already kind of covered that, but just I think I love that they're the different topics that are covered. Just kind of tie everything together, where you are getting people's stories, but you're also figuring out what was this actually like? What was hygiene like? What was addiction like? What were prophylactics at the time? So I was going to just mention that.
Not very practical. Not very practical prophylactics.
Did you manage to find any?
Well, I was telling someone the other day that the best condom that I saw looked like it had a little red ribbon around the end of it that you tied it on with, and it has like a little rose drawing, like it looks like a little rose tattoo. I've always wanted to make condoms. I think that would be really chic packaging.
I don't think it's a coincidence. And again, at the Good Brothel in the book, they have their own house packaging.
I mean,
on the imported, yeah.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. It's my design.
Well, so you have much to look forward to, not merely the book, but possible, talk about time travel, brothels, condom lines, the sky's the limit. The book is really wonderful, and I urge you all to read it. And
unless someone else has a question, but you probably haven't read it yet since it just came out yesterday.
That's always kind of the problem with.
This is my first talk for this book. It's really exciting. Thank you guys for coming and meeting me.